More people live in Northern Europe than anywhere else on the planet. With its proud cities, history, art and culture, it's home to a population of 250 million. Yet beneath our feet, the Earth is packed with vast forces waiting to explode.
The majority of people don't know that earthquake could come. They think they're like volcanoes or elephants. They come from someplace else.
Japan, America, Indonesia are known hotspots. But now scientists are forced to accept that their assessment of how, where and when earthquakes happen was wrong.
It's quite an arrogant attitude from geologists. You know, how could it happen in our backyard? It's never going to happen. These faults, these fissures, these lineations, they were all dormant. And suddenly, bang, you get a massive earthquake.
Deep within the Earth, stretching for hundreds of miles, are thousands of ancient fault lines, hidden fractures. Once thought to be extinct, these secret fissures threaten the most densely populated region on Earth, the heart of Europe. Basel, 1356. It's 7 in the evening on the 18th of October. As always, the fires are lit for the evening meal. Then the trembling starts. People run for their lives. But the medieval city turns into an inferno. It rages through the town, engulfing everything in its path. The citizens of Basel believed their massive quake had been an act of God. But we now know their city was destroyed by just one of hundreds of earthquakes which have ricocheted across northern Europe. Massive fault lines running from the Alps to the UK could trigger huge seismic waves and plunge our countries into chaos. The need to examine past quakes has now become so urgent a new science has been born. Paleoseismology, the study of ancient earthquakes.
We need to take into consideration the fact that our life is relatively short. So we have an historical memory that is perhaps 2,000 years, and our life lasts, when we're lucky, 80 years. And geological faults move on timescales of millions of years. And it would be, for us, it's very obvious to understand that there is a summer or a winter, or that one summer is warmer than another summer. But if you ask a mosquito that is only living for 3 days, it doesn't even know if it is summer or winter.
To improve upon our mosquito thinking, scientists need new ways to read the Earth's past. In France, one team investigates a chain of volcanoes previously thought to be extinct. Another in Flanders digs across old fault lines to evaluate Earth movements recorded in the sands. In Cologne, forgotten Roman ruins reveal signs of a cataclysmic quake set in mortar. And the hundreds of faults that threaten the most volatile zone in Europe, Germany's industrial heartland. In Switzerland, scientists find evidence of an extraordinary landlocked tsunami. But what has suddenly made these paleoseismologists so alarmed? After all, the hot-blooded zones of the Earth have been mapped, and they are hundreds of kilometers from northern Europe. Over the last 200 million years, the movement of the Earth's plates has slowly shaped our modern continents. The edges of these plates continue to move. Where they collide, volcanoes erupt. The Earth shudders and quakes. And mountain ranges surge skywards. The city of San Francisco is constantly threatened by the pressure of two major plates that have been forced up against each other and tear lengthways along the San Andreas Fault. In the last 100 years, San Francisco has been hit by two catastrophic quakes. In 1906, unsuspecting residents were struck by a huge magnitude 8 quake. Hundreds of buildings were shattered and 3,000 people died. In 1989, it happened again. 20,000 buildings on reclaimed land collapsed. But this time, where buildings conformed to earthquake standards, there was much less damage, and the death toll was down to 67. People who live in active zones learn to deal with a fragile Earth. But the geology of Northern Europe is very different. It's hundreds of kilometers from where plates are colliding and shaping. To understand why geologists are suddenly so anxious about earthquakes in Europe, we need to go back in time at least 20 million years. The Alps that straddle Austria, Switzerland and southern Germany were thrust upwards 22 million years ago.
There were two plates. There's the European plate and then there was the African plate, and the two of them collided together. And that's rather like if you have a carpet on the floor, kicking the carpet and the carpet starts to get ridges.
What we didn't know until now is that hundreds of kilometers from the Alps, the violent forces of collision still reverberate down through time. As the distant mountains pushed up, fractures radiated out across the European plate. This forgotten network of faults crisscrosses 900,000 square kilometers. It cuts across major cities and landmarks. Geologists now admit that these faults, which they assumed were dead, can move violently. It could trigger a chain reaction, perhaps a pan-European quake. The danger to Europe's cities and human life could be immense. Many of these faults are even older than the Alps. They've been there for 300 million years. So why did geologists ignore them?
Geologists thought that they were dead. You had hundreds and thousands of these fissures and faults, and we really thought that they would never move.
On the 8th of November 1983, a major earthquake hit the Belgian city of Liège. It was the dead of night.
Well, it was around 2:30. There was this terrible shock and this awful noise at the same time.
The chimney fell down and everything was trembling and swaying from side to side.
The giant magnitude 5 quake took the city completely by surprise. Water and gas services were ripped apart. Low-rise brick buildings split and collapsed. The town was totally paralyzed. But even though the quake caused nearly $200 million worth of damage, and 2 people were killed, geologists dismissed it as a freak of nature, a one-time event.
Hundreds and hundreds of miles from any plate boundary, we get a massive earthquake. We thought that, okay, it's a one-off, we never get earthquakes again along what we thought was real dormant, dead fractures and fissures, hundreds of miles from any plate boundary. So it was a one-off. Why worry about it? A big mistake.
Australia, 1989.
It was a typical midweek at Newcastle Workers' Club. Hundreds of mainly elderly people were inside playing games and the pokies when the quake struck. In seconds, it turned the 2-storey building into a disaster zone.
On the other side of the world, a totally unexpected tremor in the middle of an island continent shocked the scientific world. The city of Newcastle in Australia was hit by a whopping 5.6 magnitude quake.
A local reporter was doing an interview nearby when the quake hit.
13 people were killed by faults millions of years old that out of the blue shifted.
And there was disbelief among seismologists over the extent of damage in the city.
Parallels with Northern Europe were so obvious, Belgian paleoseismologist Thierry Camelbeek knew the need to investigate was critical.
Si des tremblements de terre, des grands tremblements de terre se produisent dans le centre de l'Australie.
If big earthquakes can occur in the centre of Australia, in a very stable region, I can't see any reason why there couldn't be similar earthquakes in the northwest of Europe.
Dans le nord-ouest de l'Europe.
Camelbeak was the first to connect Europe's old fault lines with earthquakes. He found unmistakable evidence that a fault millions of years old crossing Belgium had slipped. Other experts were sceptical.
They didn't believe at the beginning that those faults could be active and seismogenic, that is capable of producing large earthquakes. They considered those faults as dead faults.
Yet only 9 years after Liège, there was a quake so powerful it couldn't be ignored. On the 13th of April at 1:20 in the morning, the Dutch city of Roermond was hit by one of the largest earthquakes of modern times.
It was very bad. We grabbed a few things and ran outside. We were too frightened to go back in again.
This quake measured 5.8 on the Richter scale, 6 times more powerful than Liège, causing over $100 million worth of damage. The shock wave was felt as far away as the UK, alarming scientists who now wonder if it's just a matter of time before a seismic catastrophe strikes.
Roermond was a wake-up call. What it actually did is it spawned a whole new discipline in seismology, and 2 people in particular went off, despite everyone saying, well, this type of research wouldn't work. They went off and they started digging these sediment trenches.
The first was Thierry Camelbeak, whose research method involved digging across old fault lines. Seismologist Mustafa Megrawi joined his team. The two set out to prove that movements in the soil and sand layers at the surface directly correlate to the movement of fractures in the underlying bedrock far below. Their findings stunned the geological world.
All the geologists came visiting and have seen in the trench the fault movements, and I think we succeeded to convince people that those faults were active and were capable of producing a moderate to large earthquake.
Their success inspired them to start a new investigation. It's on part of the most threatening fault system in the region. First crucial stage is seismic analysis, using ground-penetrating radar to identify disruptions in the subsoil.
If we pass a fault scarp, then we will see the displacement, and we can see
they found what they were looking for, a significant displacement. This trench will eventually be about 100 meters long and 3 meters deep. Even at this depth, the trench floor is still 1 kilometre above the bedrock. The fault system they're searching for here runs right across northern Europe from Cologne to the North Sea. In the walls of the cut, they hope to read what happened here in the past, and maybe a warning for the future. "500 kilometres further south, Mark Davis surveys an area of the Massif Central in France, which is riddled with ancient faults.
Clermont-Ferrand is lying in a bowl right down on a vast plain, very, very flat. And then you rise up all of a sudden 500 metres onto this vast plateau that stretches out as far as the eye can see.
On top of the plateau is a chain of volcanoes, over 100 of them. In fact, the last one erupted only 3,000 years ago, in geological time, the lifespan of a mosquito. Volcanoes, like earthquakes, usually occur on the hot, fragile edges of tectonic plates, but that's nowhere near here. These volcanoes are proof of a series of persistent fault movements that recurred time and time again over 150,000 years.
You have to ask, why are all the volcanoes in these lines? There are lines of weaknesses, in other words faults, that stretch north and south of this area, and it allows magma to percolate up through the cracks from deep within the mantle.
One of the volcanoes is being quarried for the scoria that was spewed out during its most recent eruption. The mining cut runs through the heart of the volcano, where the magma pushed through the fault to the surface. The miners have cut away one complete side of the fracture, revealing the actual fault move that created the eruption. Davis and volcanologist Ben de Vries have located several deep scars, gouged out as the two hot, almost liquid rock faces slid against one another.
You can just imagine the other part of the fault that's now been quarried away and kind of scraping its way right the way along this fault plane.
And of course, now we know that this is sliding on something that was almost liquid at the same time, so we know the fault was moving at the same time as the volcano was erupting 22,000 years ago.
These volcanoes are perfect proof that the ancient fractures here moved in the past. They're not extinct. If the fractures move now, they will erupt all over again. After 10 days, Davis finds out what kind of evidence the trench can produce. On the floor, the vertical line betrays the fracture. By looking at the grain size on either side of it, the seismologists make out two soils that were laid down at different times.
We see them juxtaposed against each other at the moment.
There's a vertical displacement along this fault plane, and
there's clearly been a massive movement here.
Incredibly alike, but
eventually they'll date the soils and work out when the quake took place. The team polishes the trench walls and divides the fault area into quadrants. Lines of light and dark sand run horizontally. The highest layers were laid down most recently. They're the youngest. The bottom, the oldest. Where the pattern is broken, that's the fault. Camelbeak has found a movement so big it must have triggered an enormous earthquake.
This is not at all what I expected to see, Thierry. I expected to see just a single fault surface, but this is more like a zone, isn't it? It's multiple fractures coming through here.
Yes.
To the trained eye, it's clear that the layers on the left of the fracture line have dropped.
The gravel layer you see in 3 different steps.
Okay, so what we're essentially seeing is that this layer here originally would have been up there, and it's been just shifted down, what, how much, the whole lot?
1.2 meters.
That's around about 4 feet, yeah?
Yes.
It's incredible.
Narrow 1 meter.
Camelbeak has calculated that this 1,200-year-old fracture would have generated a colossal 6.8 magnitude earthquake. In 1995, a similar-sized quake struck Kobe in Japan. For just 20 seconds, a shockwave rocked the city. Yet 200,000 buildings were destroyed. More than 5,000 people died. Many burnt to death when gas mains, chemical and petrol plants exploded. Total loss, $100 billion. Densely populated Kobe resembles many places in northern Europe. It's a frightening reminder of what a 6.9 quake can do in less than half a minute. Quakes and volcanoes in the active zones act as the planet's safety valves. But old faults in the centre of plates are cold and brittle. They don't move often, but when they do, they're abrupt and powerful.
The stress and the strain of these pre-existing faults, it builds up and builds up, and they eventually dislocate. And when they dislocate, it releases an enormous amount of energy.
The fault.
Camelbeak's analysis has revealed that this giant 6.8 quake exposed by the trench happened around 800 AD. He believes it could have struck a settlement just 80 kilometers away in Germany. Cologne Cathedral is decorated with delicate tracery, gargoyles and statues. It's probably the most perfect Gothic structure in the world. Certainly the tallest. Its magnificent 14th century stained glass windows and magical elevated nave are famous and fragile. Part of the cathedral was built over the foundations of two earlier buildings, making it especially vulnerable to earth movements. Professor Sven Schutter has found written reference to a terrifying catastrophe that hit Cologne in 780 AD. And he's found physical proof of it hidden deep in the foundations. An earlier building was a Romanesque church to which an elegant atrium was added at the end of the 8th century. Schutter has discovered massive stone underpinnings, 5 times deeper than in the rest of the church.
We are about at a depth of 6 meters below the level of the old cathedral of shortly after 800. It seems to be built as a direct result after the earthquake, so we have these enormous foundations here.
He believes these are proof of the dramatic attempts to shore up the atrium after it was hit by a major quake. There's evidence elsewhere. In fact, the city of Cologne seems to have been battered by a cluster of quakes, about 8 of them, around 800 AD. Seismologist Klaus Hintzen finds proof in the city's geological history. Built on the River Rhine, parts of Cologne date back to Roman times. Deep beneath the city, the remains of a giant hall were discovered in 1953. When Cologne was the capital of Rome's Germania Inferior, this praetorium was the governor's palace. Hintzen investigates how the huge foundations were torn apart.
Here we have a massive wall built out of stones with Roman concrete in between, and this is fractured through. What we see here is that this part here has settled down about 24 centimeters, and that happened especially at this place here because we have a change in the foundation. Over here we have a very massive foundation of Roman concrete, and here we have only artificial fill. We see that the whole eastern part of the building, which was facing the Rhine River, it's slid down the slope towards the Rhine, and it inclined up to 6 to 7 degrees. That is more than the Leaning Tower in Pisa.
The praetorium was built over soft reclaimed land on the banks of the Rhine. Hintzen believes that when the quake hit, the vibrations turned the water-saturated ground into quicksand. It's a phenomenon called liquefaction. Violent trembling of saturated soil or sand breaks down its layers. The watery soil can even be forced upward through it, and the soil turns into a kind of liquid that can't support any weight.
Cologne and also many other of the cities here in the Lower Rhine practically sit on top of soft sediments which form something like a punch bowl. You know, it's like a bowl that is filled with a layer of sediments.
Parts of the city are even more at risk because they've been built on rubble. the remains of generations of demolished houses.
On the eastern side of the cathedral we have huge layers, up to 10-12 meters, filled up with debris of houses built in Roman times, and in these debris, which is very, very weak, the present cathedral was built. So if a shock comes through this rubble and all these filled up layers, it's very dangerous for this part of the cathedral, while the present towers, they are so stable and so massive that they wouldn't fall.
So, what effect would a 6.8 magnitude quake have on the cathedral? The cathedral and many of Cologne's magnificent buildings would be severely damaged. Victims of earthquakes the world over know it's not the quakes, but the buildings which collapse that kill. But the most lethal side effects could be the fires. How likely is a quake of this scale within the lower Rhine area?
We know about, in total, 400 kilometers of active faults that cut through this area. The area is cut into several blocks, and the blocks move with respect to each other. And in the past 25 to 30 million years, the center part has subsided by more than a kilometer.
This massive network of faults cuts right through the Ruhr Valley, the heart of Germany's complex industrial zone. It's filled with factories and petrochemical plants.
In Germany, there is no existing standard for how petrochemical plants or chemical plants have to be designed in case of an earthquake.
A 6.8 magnitude quake here could even trigger quakes across Germany, Belgium and Holland. Explosive fires and poisonous fumes would pour out across the valley. The entire country and most of northwestern Europe would feel the impact. When a fire broke out in an oil refinery in Hertfordshire, England in 2005, it took 3 days to douse the flames, and the black plume spread out right across the North Sea. But there is no doubt that the most volatile area in northern Europe is south of Cologne, the Upper Rhine Graben. The Graben is a huge trough that's formed as the ground between two parallel faults sinks. It's about 2 kilometers deep. The faults that run along its edges are still active.
This is a particularly dangerous area. If an earthquake could happen here, cities like Frankfurt to the north and Strasbourg to the south could be badly damaged.
Mustafa Megrawi set out to make a special study of the Rhine-Graben faults to establish which fractures have moved and when. Basel, just over the border from Germany in Switzerland, sits on the lower edge of the Graben. This cathedral was rebuilt after Basel was struck by a 6.9 earthquake, the greatest seismic disaster in recorded history ever to hit Europe.
We can imagine a shaking and a strong seismic wave coming from the south and propagating toward the north. And you could imagine how the houses and the cathedral would have suffered at that time from the shaking.
The medieval city of Basel is built on the banks of the Rhine River, straddling the two massive faults. It's a geological time bomb. But nobody knew about the faults back in 1356. The city was not a very big city by modern standards. It had about 10,000 inhabitants. But it was a key cross route and rich trading point. A rare eyewitness account, the chronicles of a Dominican monk, Konrad von Waltenkofen, describe what happened here 700 years ago.
In the year of our Lord, 1356,
There were many terrible earthquakes.
On the morning of the 18th of October, the tremors started again.
Das Beben dauerte mehrere Stunden.
The shaking sustained for hours. Then, as dusk approached, ceased as quickly as it had begun.
Many who had left returned to their homes. They believed the worst was over. It's 7 in the evening. There's a rumbling noise. The whole town begins to shake. Tiles, bricks and chimneys hurtle down. Houses start to fall apart. The favourite works of man are destroyed. But for many it is too late. Hearth fires spill and flare out of control. They engulf the whole town, and the bonfire burns for a week.
People couldn't stay in the town. They had to get out and sleep in the fields. Many were injured and they were hungry.
The city is razed to the ground, and thousands perish. The people of Basel thought God had deserted them. Castles and churches for over 150-kilometre radius were destroyed. There have been 28 serious quakes in this region in the last 700 years. When the next huge quake happens, will it hit Basel again? That's the question facing the head of the Swiss Seismology Service, Domenico Giardini. If a massive quake strikes, what would happen to the modern city of Basel?
Geological events are very rarely unique. There is a pattern and they come back, so geology tells us that these events are not unique. We need to learn how to deal with large catastrophes, which could come back at any time. The houses that are behind us now are historical houses. There is still a lot of wood inside there. The alleys are very narrow, and so as soon as a few of the houses collapse, it's very difficult to reach and it's very difficult to put down a fire when it starts. There are buildings which have been built a lot in the 60s, a lot in the 20s, and many of these buildings, the majority of them I would say, were not built according to any seismic design, and several of them we know are not in good stand and will not be able to withstand an earthquake.
What effect would a 6.9 quake have on the city now?
We are capable today of modeling what would happen if an earthquake would come back today. The city is divided in two parts by the border of the Rhine-Graben. This part of the city is built on sediments, this part of the city is built on rock. We then simulate an earthquake coming, in this case, from the southeast. So we can see here the waves arriving, and when they hit the parts where the sediments are, will keep vibrating much longer, while the part of the city which is built on rock, it's already quiet. Here, the earthquake goes on and on and on, and this is what would produce then the damage to the buildings that we're seeing here across the river.
The next one could be in hundreds of years, or it could be tomorrow. An area with a bizarre earthquake history, equally forgotten, lies 80 kilometres further south, at the foot of the Alps. Seismologist Flavio Anselmetti has come to Lucerne to study one of the strangest geological events ever known. Archivist Peter Camber has located the handwritten diary of Renoir Seisat. It describes an extraordinary event.
Zinstag, den 18. Tag Septembers des 16. und 1. Jahres.
On Tuesday, the 18th of September, 1601, a strong and frightening earthquake hit the area around Lucerne. Seisat describes how the water drained from the lake floor. It was a terrifying sight. Yet young people ran across the riverbed on foot. At the time, Lucerne was a small, walled town. South of the bridge, the ground was marshy, so the houses were built on stilts. Seisat says a giant wave then rolled in. The waves came again and again, he says, 6 every hour, back and forth, as if in a bathtub. And it went on for 3 days. Lake Lucerne today seems peaceful enough, but the secret of its violent past is still locked in.
The lake gives us like the instrument of ancient times that can record these earthquakes, because otherwise it's tricky to find traces of old earthquakes.
Inspired by Seisat's writings, Anselmetti pieces together exactly what happened here 400 years ago. Sediments have been building up for the past 15,000 years, ever since the lake was formed during the last ice age. Wooden piers mark a submerged settlement 5,000 years old. Further into the settlement, the ground splits apart. A giant underwater cliff shows where tons of earth has slumped forward deep into the lake.
There's no way to make such a cliff with those structures just from slow movement. I think there had to be kind of like an event that created that cliff. So I think it's a fairly good sign that indeed this was a catastrophic event that moved down that slope.
The horrified townspeople took the violent shaking and pounding waves as a sign of God's anger. But on the very first day it ended, Seisat, the city clerk, took on the job of documenting exactly what had taken place. Seisat describes how boats were tossed 3 gunshot lengths inland. Some ended up in trees, unmanned ships were torn off the piers, dead fish piled up on the banks. His final observation provided a crucial clue to the cause of the giant waves. He observed that underwater mountains and hills were broken apart and sucked down into the depths of the lake. His precise observations give the 21st century seismology team remarkable insight into what happened in 1601 and why. Anselmetti has found evidence that the shaking dislodged millions of cubic meters of submerged mud. This happened 13 times in different parts of the lake. When the mud slumped forward, it produced mountainous waves nearly 1 kilometer long. Tsunamis.
This is the wave that goes here across the lake, that arrives here at the coast with a wave amplitude of maybe 3 to 4 meters or 10 to 13 feet.
The lake floor contains another kind of evidence. The team take test cores from the layers of sediment. They drop a metal probe from a fixed gantry 300 meters to the lake floor.
So the whole purpose of it, to get as undisturbed as possible, just a vertical core section of mud.
Modern-day seismic techniques, directed by the astute observations of a clerk over 400 years ago, gradually reveal the secrets of Lake Lucerne and its ancient earthquake history. They winch the probe to the surface after a few minutes. The 10-metre plug will tell the story of Lake Lucerne over the past 15,000 years.
Okay, so here we have this 10-metre long sediment core that we took vertically out of the subsurface of the lake. And basically the deeper we go, the older the time will be. It's like a time journey back into our past.
The coloured bands show periods of calm, where sediments settled.
If you look further down, suddenly this nice layering, this quiet sedimentation, suddenly here gets interrupted. And this, in fact, we're really sure is the result of these water movements, of these tsunami waves at the bottom of the lake. And so basically all of this, almost 2 meters of sediment here, actually really are related to this 1601 earthquake. And
further down the core, a period of stability.
I think we basically caught here another earthquake.
Then another quake in about 470 BC.
And I would guess its age, and this is very similar to the 1601 earthquake. So we can get somehow an idea on how often these earthquakes occur here in this area.
Over the entire core span, there's a constant recurrence of large earthquakes, sometimes hundreds of years apart, sometimes thousands. Compelling evidence that it was no freak event. The tsunami could happen again. In summer, the Lake Lucerne area has a population of 500,000. If a 6.9 quake triggered a tsunami today, the impact would be enormous. The first sign would be the receding waters. Mountains of water shoot into movement propelled by the tons of mud crashing to the lake floor. Gigantic waves speed towards the town. Lucerne's pretty bridges and buildings wouldn't stand a chance. The tsunami resonates, roaring up and down the lake time and time again. But the big question is, will that happen? And if so, when?
So ironically, the fact that they occur less frequent makes it even more difficult to predict and more dangerous.
Several branches of these ancient fault systems cut across the English Channel. The UK, once considered seismically stable, is actually riddled with faults. Some cut right through London. Dr. Roger Musson is the foremost expert on historical earthquakes in Britain.
And of course, if this falls into a street that's crowded with pedestrians, there's always a danger that somebody's going to get hit.
He's found plenty of evidence of a turbulent past.
Britain has had a long and complex geological history, and it's left behind faults absolutely everywhere. I don't care where you are, the nearest fault to you is directly underneath you, and so certainly there are faults under the centre of London.
In 1750, the heart of London was hit by its 2 most infamous quakes.
The epicentre of the first one, as far as we can determine it from the accounts that survive, must have been just about here.
When, a month later, the second quake happened, blind panic broke out. The cartoonist Hogarth satirised people's terror as they fled. Again, the clergy claimed it was a judgment from God.
Now, where there's an earthquake, there must be a fault. So directly under our feet, somewhere, there is a fault.
But it was 200 years earlier, at Easter in 1580, that Londoners were hit by one of the most powerful quakes on record. The noise was horrific. Shaking church towers made bells peal right across the town. People poured out of theatres. Crashing spires and chimneys, chunks of wall, parapets tumbled onto passers-by. The epicentre was 80 kilometres away, in the English Channel. But it was felt right across the country and in France. Hundreds were drowned by floods and swept away by rogue waves. But what if a quake that size hit London today? Like most of Europe, the capital is completely unprepared. Over 7 million people fill the city during the rush hour. Trains, roads, buses and subways are crammed. As ground tremors build, brick houses, some hundreds of years old, start to fracture. Falling glass and masonry rain down on the streets. Anyone near is in danger. Gas and water mains rupture, causing fires and explosions. Rail tracks buckle. Electricity failures cripple communications. Traffic is gridlocked. The young, the sick and the elderly start to die. Seismologists' research into the thousands of ancient faults in northern Europe is just beginning. How these fractures will behave in the future, they still don't know.
It's laid down by water. Yes, yeah.
Yet the seismic history they're rediscovering tells us that somewhere soon a big quake is inevitable. But what of the nightmare scenario? What if one fault triggered another, or several faults moved at the same time? Scientists now believe that these ancient faults can cause cluster quakes, a spate of quakes that ricochet from one fault line to another over and over again. The sense of stability enshrined in Europe's cherished towns and cities would be shattered. The most feared outcome, the loss of human life, incalculable.
Of course, everybody wants to know when the next earthquake will happen, and this we cannot predict. We only can say certainly there will be the next event to come. But it can be tomorrow, it can be in 6,000 years.
The fact of the matter is we just don't know how big, where and when it's going to strike.
The study of ancient quakes is changing our understanding of the Earth, unlocking evidence of terrifying power stretching way beyond human memory. Our seemingly safe world is in danger from a force that could be unleashed at any time. We need to think differently, beyond today, to research, to test, to prepare. We need to face up to the unexpected fragility of our planet before it is too late.